Our principal speaker is a noted author, scientist, and teacher whose awards and honors are almost beyond either counting or recitation. They span both academic and popular areas, reflecting intellectual brilliance as well as deep concern for the future of our race. Born November 9, 1934 in New York City, he journeyed west for post-high school education, winning honors at the University of Chicago. Those early academic achievements presaged the brilliant career that has followed. Dr. Carl Sagan is currently the David Duncan Professor of Astronomy and Space Sciences and Director of the Laboratory for Planetary Studies at Cornell University. Dr. Sagan has established his reputation not only in astronomy, but also in biology, physics, the study of extraterrestrial life, and the advocacy of peace. His scientific research has enhanced understanding of the greenhouse effect on Venus, dust storms on Mars, the organic haze on Titan, and the origin of life itself in the search for life off the planet Earth. He has played a leading role in the Mariner, Viking, and Voyager expeditions to the planets, and for this has received the NASA Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement, among many other awards. Dr. Sagan was responsible for the Pioneer 10 and 11 plaques and the Voyager 1 and 2 interstellar records, messages about the human race sent to possible future or other civilizations in space. He is perhaps best known for his Emmy and Peabody Award-winning public television series, Cosmos. His book by the same title is the best-selling science book ever published in the English language. In recent years, Dr. Sagan has devoted much of his time to writing and lecturing about the long-term effects of nuclear warfare. His vision as a scientist of the death and devastation that would be brought about by the effects of radiation has made him a leading spokesman for nuclear disarmament. He is currently president of the Planetary Society, which is a 100,000 member organization and the largest space interest group in the world. He's also serving as distinguished visiting scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology. Please welcome with me Dr. Carl Sagan.
Thank you, Judge Spicer. I'm very moved and honored to be invited to join you in the celebration of this doleful and instructive event. There were 51,000 human beings who were casualties here, ancestors of some of us, but brothers of us all. This was the first full-fledged example of an industrialized war. Machine-made arms, railroad transport of men and materiel. This was the first hint of an age yet to come, our age, of what technology bent to the purposes of war might be capable of. In May 1863, a reconnaissance balloon of the Army of the Potomac detected movement of Confederate troops across the Rappahannock River, the beginning of the campaign that led to the Battle of Gettysburg. That balloon was the precursor of the reconnaissance satellite. In all, there were a few hundred artillery pieces used in the three-day Battle of Gettysburg. What could they do? What was war like at that time? Here is a brief comment by Frank Haskell of Wisconsin, who fought in the Union armies here, in a private letter to his brother. "We could not often see the shell before it burst," he said. "But sometimes, as we faced towards the enemy and looked above our heads, the approach would be heralded by a prolonged hiss, which always seemed to me to be a line of something tangible, terminating in a black globe, distinct to the eye, as the sound had been to the ear. The shell would seem to stop and hang suspended in the air an instant, and then vanish in fire and smoke and noise. Not 10 yards away from us, a shell burst among some bushes where sat 3 or 4 orderlies holding horses. 2 of the men and 1 horse were killed. A typical event from the Battle of Gettysburg. Something like this was repeated tens of thousands of times. Those ballistic projectiles shot out of the cannons that you can see at the Gettysburg Memorial had a range of 1 or a few miles. The mass of explosive was about 20 pounds at most. That is roughly 1/100th of a ton of TNT, enough to kill a few people. The largest chemical explosives used in World War II were the blockbusters, so-called because they could destroy a city block. They had in them about 10 tons of TNT, 1,000 times more than the most powerful armament at the Battle of Gettysburg. That was sufficient to kill a few dozen people. At the very end of World War II, the United States used the first atomic bombs to annihilate 2 Japanese cities. Those weapons had the equivalent power of 10,000 tons of TNT, enough to kill a few 100,000 people, 1 bomb. And then a few years later, the United States and the Soviet Union developed the first thermonuclear weapons, the first hydrogen bombs. They had an explosive yield equivalent to 10 million tons of TNT, enough to kill a few million people, 1 bomb. Each of these steps is a factor of 1,000. From Gettysburg to the blockbuster, 1,000 times more power. From the blockbuster to the atomic bomb, 1,000 times more yet. From the atomic bomb to the hydrogen bomb, 1,000 times more. All in all, 1 billion times more explosive force from Gettysburg to today. The souls that perished here would find such carnage, the carnage we are capable of today, unspeakable. Today, the United States and the Soviet Union have booby-trapped our planet with 60,000 nuclear weapons, most of them hydrogen bombs. 60,000 nuclear weapons. The direct and long-term consequences of the use of even 1/3 or 1/2 of those nuclear weapons would be, without question, to annihilate those 2 nations, to probably destroy the global civilization, and perhaps to destroy the human species. This is too much destructive force. It is too much power. It is foolish to have such technology on this fragile planet. Those 51,000 casualties here, they represented 1/3 of the Confederate Army, 1/4 of the Union Army. But all those deaths, with one exception, were all soldiers. The only exception was one civilian who thought to bake some bread in her own house and was shot through 2 doors. Her name was Jenny Wade. But in a global thermonuclear war, almost all the casualties, almost all the deaths will be civilians, men, women, and children, including the citizens of nations that had no part in the quarrel which led to the war, nations far away from the northern mid-latitude target zone. Everyone is now at risk. In Washington, there is a memorial to the Americans who died in the most recent large American war, the Vietnam War. Some 58,000 Americans died, not a very different number from the number of casualties here at Gettysburg. I ignore, as we often do, the 1 million Southeast Asians who were killed in that war. But think of that dark, somber, beautiful, moving, touching memorial in Washington. Think of how long it is. It's not much longer than from the end of the row here to the end of the row there. 58,000 names. Imagine now that we are so foolish as to permit a nuclear war to occur. And imagine that somehow a similar memorial wall could be built. How long would it be? It would be about 1,000 miles long. It would extend from here to, I don't know, St. Louis. But of course, there would be no one to build it and no one to read it. It is time for us to learn from the sacrifice of those who fell here, and it is time to act. In 1945, at the close of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were effectively invulnerable. Consider the United States bounded east and west by vast, impassable oceans, north and south by weak and friendly neighbors, the most powerful armed forces, the most powerful economy on the planet. We had nothing to fear. So we built nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. We engaged in an arms race with the Soviets. And at the end of that time, everyone in the United States is exquisitely vulnerable to a decision on our lives and deaths made in Moscow 20 minutes ago. And likewise, in perfect symmetry, the Soviet Union, which had the largest standing army in the world in 1945, no significant military threats it had to worry about, it also engaged in this nuclear arms race with the United States. And today, everyone in the Soviet Union is exquisitely vulnerable to a decision made in Washington. The lives and deaths of every Soviet citizen is in the hands of leaders in a foreign country. I say we have done something immensely foolish. We have spent 43 years in making ourselves vulnerable to instant annihilation, all done in the name of patriotism and safety. Now, all that cost something. The Cold War didn't come for free. How much did the Cold War cost? The American cost, we can easily tabulate. The Soviet cost is more difficult to tabulate, but almost certainly is roughly the same number. By the time the present administration leaves office next January, the United States will have spent, in 1987 dollars, how much money on the Cold War? The answer is $10 trillion. That's the one with the big T, trillion. Of this sum, more than a third has been spent by the Reagan administration, which has added more to the national debt than all previous administrations back to the presidency of George Washington combined. How much is $10 trillion? What could you buy for $10 trillion? The answer is everything. You could buy everything in the United States except the land for $10 trillion. Everything. All the houses, airplanes, factories, skyscrapers, highways, railroads, stores, homes, food, clothing, medicine, furniture, toys, games, babies' diapers, everything but the land in the United States could be bought for what we have spent on the Cold War. A business that spent its capital so recklessly and with so little effect would have been bankrupt long ago. Executives who could not recognize so clear a failure of corporate policy would long before now have been dismissed by the stockholders. What else could the United States have done with that money? Not all of it, because prudent defense is of course necessary, but some fraction of it, a third or a quarter, something like that. We could have made major progress towards eliminating hunger, homelessness, infectious disease, illiteracy, ignorance, poverty, not just in the United States, but worldwide. We could have helped make the planet agriculturally self-sufficient and removed many of the causes of violence and war. And this could have been done with enormous benefit to the American economy. Think what prodigies of human inventiveness in art, architecture, medicine, science, and technology could have been supported for decades with the tiniest fraction of that money. I say we have done something immensely foolish. We have been locked in a deadly embrace with the Soviet Union, always propelled each side by the malefactions of the other, always looking in the short term to the next congressional election, to the next presidential election, to narrow local politics and never seeing the big picture. A man associated with this community, Dwight Eisenhower, said the following about this very situation. He said, "The problem in defense spending is to figure out how far you should go without destroying from within what you are trying to defend from without." It would be very good to pay some attention to what President Eisenhower said. What is clearly needed is a comprehensive test ban treaty to stop all future nuclear weapons tests, because they are the technological driver that propels, on both sides, the nuclear arms race. We need to abandon the utter and ruinously expensive foolishness of Star Wars, which detracts, not adds, to the national security of the United States. And we need to make safe, massive, bilateral, thoroughly inspected reductions in the strategic and tactical nuclear arsenals of the United States, the Soviet Union, and all other nations. That's obviously what we should be doing. Because nuclear weapons are comparatively cheap, the big ticket item is conventional weapons. There is an extraordinary opportunity that faces us right now. A miracle has happened in the Soviet Union. There's somebody not just reasonable, but smart, with a long-term vision, with concern for precisely the same problems in his nation that we should be concerned with in ours. And therefore, there is a clear commonality of purpose. Mr. Gorbachev has proposed massive conventional force reductions in Europe. He's willing to do it asymmetrically, in which the Soviets reduce their forces more than the Americans do. And I say that is in the interest of peace, and it is in the interest of a sane and hearty American economy. We ought to meet him halfway. The world spends today $1 trillion a year on armaments, most of it conventional arms. Much of that money is spent only because the nations are unable to reconcile one to another. That money is taken out of the mouths of poor people. It is taken out of effective economies. It is a scandalous waste, and we ought not to countenance it. It is time to learn from those who fell here, and it is time to act. In part, this Civil War was about liberty, about extending the benefits of the American Revolution to all Americans, to every American, to make true to everyone the promise of liberty and justice for all. I'm concerned about a lack of historical pattern recognition. Today, the fighters for freedom do not necessarily wear three-cornered hats and play the fife and drum. They come in other costumes. The creed of liberty means nothing if it is only our liberty being so proudly proclaimed. People elsewhere are crying, no taxation without representation. And in South Africa, for example, or the West Bank, or Central America, in increasing numbers they are crying, give me liberty or give me death. Why are we unable to hear them? We have powerful, nonviolent means of persuasion available to us, we Americans. Why are we not using these means? It is time to learn from those who fell here. It is time to learn and to act. This war was mainly about union. Union in the face of differences. You know, 1,000,000 years ago, there were no nations on the planet. There were no tribes. The humans who were here were divided into small family groups of a few dozen people who wandered. That was the horizon of our identification. Since then, the horizons have expanded from such a wandering hunter-gatherer group to a tribe, to a horde, to a small city-state, to a nation, and today to immense nation-states. The average person on the earth today owes his or her primary allegiance to a group of something like 100 million people. It seems very clear that if we do not destroy ourselves first, the unit of primary identification of human beings will before long be the entire planet and the entire human species. And to my mind, that is the key question, whether that fundamental unit of identification happens before we destroy ourselves. The identification horizons have been broadened in this place 125 years ago at great cost. At cost to the North and the South, at cost to blacks and whites. But we recognize that that expansion of identification horizons was just. Today, there is an urgent, practical necessity to work together in arms control, in the world economy, in the global environment, it is clear that the nations of the world now can only rise and fall together. It is not a question of one nation winning at the expense of another. We must all help one another. On occasions like this, it's customary to quote homilies, phrases by great men and women we've all heard before, and we tend not to hear. Let me mention one, a phrase that was said here just a little less than 125 years ago by President Lincoln. With malice toward none, with charity for all. We tend not to hear. With malice toward none, with charity for all. That's what is expected of us. Not just because our ethics commend it, our religious teaching preaches it, but because it is necessary for human survival. Here's another one. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Let me vary it a little. A species divided against itself cannot stand. A planet divided against itself cannot stand. Can we hear? To be inscribed on this monument is a lovely phrase. On this eternal light peace memorial, which is about to be rekindled and rededicated. The phrase is, a world united in the search for peace. A world united in the search for peace. We need more than anniversary sentimentalism and holiday piety. We must confront the conventional wisdom where necessary. We must act where necessary. The real triumph of Gettysburg was not, I think, in 1863, but 50 years later, when the veterans. It is time now for us to emulate them. NATO and the Warsaw Pact, Israelis and Palestinians, whites and blacks, Americans and Iranians, the developed and the underdeveloped worlds. The challenge for us is to do it not after the carnage and the mass murder, but instead of the carnage and the mass murder. It is time to learn from those who fell here. It is time to act. Thank you very much.